Hi, we're going to go ahead and read Don't Be Silly, Mrs. Millie by Judy Cox and illustrated by Joe Manthe. Judy Cox is the one who wrote it, and an illustrator is the one who draws pictures. So Joe Manthe was the one who drew these pictures. And I hope you enjoy. Mrs. Millie, our teacher, is really silly. Every day she says, "Good morning, children. Please hang up your goats." "Don't be silly, Mrs. Millie. You mean our coats." Oh, look at that. Goats hung up. At 8 o'clock, our teacher announces, "Please rise for the frog salute." "Oh no," we shout. "You mean the flag salute." Those frogs. At 9 o'clock, "Time to write," Mrs. Millie says. "Get out your paper and penguins." "Don't be silly, Mrs. Millie. You mean our paper and pencils." At 10 o'clock, it's recess time, and our teacher looks out the window. "It just stopped raining cats and dogs. Don't step in a poodle." "Don't you mean a puddle?" we ask, giggling. We play outside until our teacher blows her whistle. "Recess is over," she yells. "It's time to chameleon." "Don't be silly, Mrs. Millie. Don't you mean it's time to come in?" At 11 o'clock, Mrs. Millie says, "You may get drinks, but don't cut in line." "You mean the line," we yell. At 12 o'clock, our teacher announces, "Time for lunch. Wash your hands with soap and walrus." "You're silly, Mrs. Millie. You mean soap and water." Look at that walrus. As we get in line, Mrs. Millie reminds us, "Don't forget your lunch bunny." "Oh, that's right, our lunch money," we shout. Mrs. Millie puts on her glasses to read the menu. "We have gorilla cheese sandwiches today." "Don't be silly, Mrs. Millie. You mean grilled cheese sandwiches." At 1 o'clock, our teacher picks up a book. It's story time. "Come and sit on the bug." "You're so silly," we cry. "You mean sit on the rug." At 2 o'clock, Mrs. Millie calls us to the back of the room. It's time for art. Who wants to paint on the weasel? "You mean the easel, Mrs. Millie. How can you be so silly?" we ask. After art, our teacher asks, "Who's hungry?" "We have parrot sticks and quackers." "Wait a minute. We know what you mean. Carrot sticks and crackers," we yell. At 3 o'clock, Mrs. Millie smiles. "What a fun day we've had, but it's time to go home. Put on your bats and kittens." "Don't be silly, Mrs. Millie. You mean our hat and mittens." When we're ready to leave, our teacher goes to the door. "Butterfly, children." "No, Mrs. Millie," we shout. You don't mean butterfly. You mean goodbye." Mrs. Millie laughs. We laugh too. "Butterfly, Mrs. Millie. See you, gator." And we wave goodbye as we get on the octopus. That's a silly book. Mrs. Millie gets a lot of things mixed up. But I think she's just being silly. But I think her students liked it. They think it's funny. Thank you.